In this Blender tutorial, I will show you how to create this procedural brick material in Blender. Now this isn't a brick wall material, this is just a single brick. But if you'd like to learn how to create a procedural brick wall material, then I have another tutorial on how to create a procedural brick wall material, and you can check that out with the link in the description. And if you'd like to help support me and this channel and purchase the procedural material, then you can do that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. And if you like using procedural materials in your project, then definitely check out my Blender procedural material packs. So they're packs of 10 realistic procedural materials created with Blender's procedural nodes. And if you'd like to learn how to create more procedural materials, then you can also check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist with the link in the description. So before we start, I wanted to show you what I have set up in the 3D space if you want to set it up the same way that I have. So I pressed Shift A, I went here to Mesh, and I added a cube. And then I've been trying to remember to model things to the real life scale in Blender, so I'm going to do that. So I'll press the Tab key to go into edit mode, and when you add a default cube, the default cube is a bit higher than an average person height. So I'm going to tab into edit mode, I'm going to scale the entire thing down, and I'm going to make this much smaller to kind of the size of a brick. And I'm not trying to get the size exact, but just close to the real life scale. So I'm going to scale this down a bit smaller, and I could also scale this out on the y-axis a bit, and then I'm going to scale it way out on the x-axis so that it is a brick shape. Just like that. Now I'm going to be using the displacements in the node editor, and so because I'm using the displacements, I want to give this object more geometry. So what I'm going to do is press Ctrl R to add a loop cut, and then I'm going to scroll my mouse wheel so that there are two. And then I can just left click and right click so it stays in the center. And what I'm trying to do is get each face here to be about an even square. And that way the detail will be more even around the entire object. So I could scale this on the x-axis, make it a bit smaller. I might also scale it down on the z-axis a little bit. Then I can press Ctrl R to add another loop cut, and I can left click and right click so it stays in the center there. So now each one of those faces are about an even square shape. So now that these are all an even shape, I can press the A key to select everything, and then I'm going to use the object context menu. So you can just right click to bring up the object context menu. I use the right click select mode in Blender, so I hit the W key to bring up the object context menu. And then I can just click on subdivide. And I'm just going to continue to do that, so I'll just subdivide this a few more times so that it's about that detail. And this way the displacements in the node editor will have more geometry to work with. So I can press the Tab key to go back to object mode. And then using the object context menu in object mode, I will shade the object smooth. So I now want to give this brick even more geometry. So to do that, I'm going to go over here to the modifier properties, and I'm going to click on add modifier, and I'm going to add the subdivision surface. And I will set the levels viewport and render both up to 2 so that it has more geometry. So then what I did is I just duplicated some of these bricks and I made kind of like a brick pile to preview the material on. And then I also added a camera, and I just pointed the camera right down here at the bricks so that we can preview that. And also if you go right over here to the object data properties with the camera selected, I set the focal length to 80. I just like that a bit better so the camera looks like it's kind of zoomed in a little bit more. Now for the lighting, if you go right over here to the world properties, I added in this Photo Studio Broadway Hall. So this is a free HDRI from polyhaven.com. Link will be in the description if you'd like to download it, and I downloaded the 1K HDR version. So on the world settings here, if you click on color and click on that yellow dot, you can choose environment texture, and then you can click on open and open up the HDRI. And then I also turned the strength of the HDRI down to just 0.8, so it's a little bit darker than the default. And then I also added these two lights here. So these are just two area lights, and I kind of pointed them at the bricks. And right over here on the object data properties, both of these lights I set to a strength of 200, and then I set the color of both of these lights to a very slight yellow color. Now, if you click right here on the render properties, if you want to use the displacements in the node editor, then you will need to be using the cycles rendering engine because the displacements will not work in Eevee. So I'm going to be using cycles. Now, if you also click right down here on the very bottom tab on the color management, I am using the view transform of Filmic, and also on the look here, I set this to very high contrast, and this will kind of pop out the colors and make things more contrasty and saturated. And then also, if you want to make the background transparent, if you open up the film tab, you can click on the transparent button, and that way you won't be able to see the HDRI in the background. Alright, so I am in the shader editor, so I have the 3D viewport right here, and I'm in the rendered mode, and then I have the shader editor right over here. So I'm just going to click on the brick here, and I can click on new, and I can just rename the material. And then I can click and drag, and I can drop this material onto the other two bricks. And there is one more really important thing we need to do to make sure that the displacement works. We need to click right here on the material properties, and if you scroll all the way down, or actually close this tab, we want to open up the settings tab, and we want to go to the surface, and right here it says displacement. We want to set this to displacement and bump, and this is telling the material that it can use the displacement. So I'll just make this tab smaller. And then one more thing, I will also be using the Node Wrangler add-on to preview the different nodes. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click on edit, and you can go to the preferences, and then over there on the add-ons tab you can search for Node Wrangler and just check mark the Node Wrangler add-on. And it's built into Blender, so I'll show you how to use it in the video. So to start off, I want to add a little bit of noise on the bricks. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to add the noise texture, and let's stick the noise texture right here. And then with the noise texture selected, I can press Ctrl T, and that is going to add the texture coordinate and mapping, and that is using a feature of the Node Wrangler. And then also let's hold down the Ctrl and Shift key and select the noise texture, and that is going to preview the texture on the object. And you can see the texture looks a little bit stretched, so I want to use the object coordinates, so let's put the object into the vector of the mapping. And so now you can see that the noise texture is placed more evenly. And I'm going to leave the mapping node because we can plug the mapping node into each of the textures, and then we can use the scale value here to actually scale the entire material. So now let's change some of the noise texture settings. So I'm going to turn the scale up to like a 20. I think 20 is pretty good. And then I do want it to be very detailed, so let's turn the detail all the way to the max of 15. And then if you kind of zoom in here, if I turn up the roughness a little bit, you can see it looks a bit more rough and kind of has even more detail. So I'm going to turn the detail to like a 0.7. And then also just to give it a little bit more randomness, I will turn the distortion to like a 0.1. So I now want to take the factor of the noise texture, and I'm going to put that into the base color of the principled shader. And I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview that. Now that doesn't really look like brick because it's not like a reddish or brownish color. So to change the colors, I can press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the color ramp node, and let's stick the color ramp in the wire between the noise texture and the principled shader. And then I can kind of drag these two tabs together if I want to make them a bit more contrasty. And then I want to make this kind of like a red brick. So on the white tab here, I can click on the color, and I'm going to make this kind of a red color and then also a little bit darker. And if you want to use the same exact hex value that I'm using right here on this color, if you go to the hex, you can punch in 8E3020. That's the exact color that I'll be using. And then for this black tab here, I'm going to drag it out a little bit. And then instead of it being fully black, I'm going to click on the color, and I'm going to make this a bit brighter. And I'm going to make this a pretty strong, kind of like orangey reddish color. And then I'll make it very dark. So it's basically going to be a very dark brown. And the hex value that I'll be using for this color will be 190E05. Now these bricks are a little bit shiny, and I do want to make them a bit more rough. So let's take the factor here, and I want to put that into the roughness, and that way the roughness value won't just be a single value, but some parts will be a little bit more rough and other parts will be a bit more reflective. Now I want to control this because if you look here on the side, you can see it still is pretty shiny and bricks are very rough. So I'm going to click on this color ramp, and I can press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's stick it in between the noise texture and the roughness. And then I can hit the backspace, and that is going to reset the color ramp. So make sure the color ramp is selected, and then you can hit the backspace. So now I can change the colors of the color ramp, and that's going to change how rough and shiny the material is. So if the values are darker, they're going to be more shiny, but if they are lighter, they're going to be more rough. So I can click on the black tab and click on the color here, and I can turn this up, and you can see as I turn it up, it's going to be much more rough. And the hex value that I'll be using is going to be D1, D1, D1. So now you can see the bricks look very rough. Now I also want to put this noise texture into the normal to give it some bump. So let's take the factor here, and I can put that into the normal. Now we have some weird shading issues here, and that's because this is black and white data, but then this is normal data. So we need to convert the black and white data into normal data that the principled shader can use. So let's press Shift A. I can go here to the search, and I can search for the bump node. node, and let's put the bump node in between the noise texture and the principled. And then I can take the factor, and let's actually put that into the height value, and that way it'll convert it to normal data. So now you can see the bricks look very bumpy. And then the strength value is a bit high at 1, so I'm going to turn it way down to just like a 0.2 so it is less strong. Now I also want to add a texture for some cracks along the bricks. So to do that, I can press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for the Voronoi texture, and let's put the Voronoi underneath the noise texture. And I can click and drag to drag a box around these nodes and bring them back a bit, and I want to take the vector and put that into the vector of the Voronoi so that it's using the object coordinates. And then I can Control Shift and select the Voronoi to preview it. Now, if I click on the F1 here, I want to change this to distance to edge. And this texture here is what we're going to use for the cracks. Now, the cracks are a little bit big, but we actually want to distort the cracks to make them look a bit more noisy and natural. And so I'm going to leave the scale at 5 because when we distort them, they'll be a bit smaller. So you can see that these cracks are very smooth and straight, but I want to make them more random. So we're going to distort the placement of the Voronoi. So let's press Shift A, I can go to the search, and I'm going to search for another noise texture, and let's just stick the noise texture down here. And then I want to take the vector of the mapping here, and I want to put that into this noise texture as well, so that they're all using the object coordinates. And then I can Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. Now I'm going to leave the scale at 5, but I am going to turn the detail all the way to the max of 15, so it's very detailed. And then I want to take the factor, and I actually want to put that into the Voronoi, and then I can Control Shift and select the Voronoi texture. So now the noise texture is distorting the placement of the Voronoi. But you can see it's distorted way too much, so I want it to have less of an effect or be less strong. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the Mix RGB, and let's stick the Mix RGB in between the noise texture and the Voronoi. And then I want to take the original object coordinates from the mapping, and I'm going to stick that into color 1 of the mix. And then I actually don't want to use the factor, I want to use the color of the noise texture, so let's put the color into color 2. So basically what we're doing is we are using this mix to mix between the noise and the original object coordinates, which aren't distorted. And then once that is mixed together, the mix is going into the Voronoi. So if I drag the factor, if I turn the factor all the way to 0, it's just using color 1, which is the original object coordinates. But if I turn the factor up, it's going to use more and more of the noise. So if I turn the factor all the way up to 1, now it's very distorted. And I actually want to click on the mix here, and I want to change this to the linear light, and that way it's going to work a bit better. So if I turn the factor down now, you can see that the texture is being distorted, but it's not moving around quite as much. And then also let's turn the factor all the way up to 1 because I do want the cracks to be very distorted and noisy. So now they look a bit more random and a bit more natural. Now I don't want there to be cracks all over the place. I just want a few little spots here and there where there's some small cracks. So what I'm going to do is click and drag just to box select all these nodes, and I'm going to bring them back so we have a bit more space. And so I'm going to mix this noise texture with the Voronoi, and we're going to make it so that the Voronoi cracks are just in some places here and there. So I'm going to click on this linear light here, and I can press Shift D to duplicate it. Let's drop it down here, and then I just want to change it back to mix. So if we click on the type here, I can just click back to mix, which is the default. And so I'm going to drop the mix after the Voronoi distance, and then I want to mix it with the noise texture. So I'm going to take the factor here, and let's put that into the factor of the mix. And then we're going to take the Voronoi distance, and we're going to put that into color 2. Then color 1 right here, I just want to make fully white. So the factor is going to control where it's going to be color 1 and where it's going to be color 2, and so the noise texture is controlling where that is. Now you can't really see the effect that it's doing because the noise texture isn't very contrasty. So I want to make the noise texture more contrasty before it goes into the mix. So to do that, I can just take any of these color ramps. I'll just click on the color ramp, and I can press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's stick it right here in between this noise texture and the mix going into the factor. So just stick it right there, and I think I'm going to box select some of these nodes and bring them down a bit so there's a bit more space. So I'll bring that down as well. And then if you click on the color ramp, you can hit the backspace, and that will reset the color ramp. So I can now start to drag these values together, and that is going to make it more contrasty. And I can actually Control Control Shift and select the color ramp to preview it. So I'm going to bring these very close together, kind of in the center, so it's very contrasty. So then the white and black values are going to tell it where the cracks are and where the cracks are going to be disappeared. So I can now Control Shift and select the mix. So now you can see that wherever the white values are on this color ramp, you can see there's like a white patch right there. That is where the cracks are going to show up. Now the cracks aren't very contrasty as well. You can see the cracks are just kind of gray, and I want the places where there aren't cracks to be joined together with this white area, so it just looks like there are cracks here and there. And also the cracks are a little bit thick, so I want to make them smaller. So again, I'm going to just kind of box select these nodes and bring them back so I have a bit more space. And then I can click on this color ramp here, and I can press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's stick it here after the Voronoi. So this is also going to make the Voronoi texture more contrasty. And I can Control Shift and select it to preview it and see what we're doing. So I'm going to drag this black tab way back, and then I'm going to drag the white tab way over. And I can also bring the black tab out just a little bit. So you can see that because we've dragged these over here, the cracks are now very thin and they're much more contrasty. So I just want to do something like that. So I can Control Shift and select the mix to preview it. And there we go. So we now just have a few little cracks here and there. So I now want to put the cracks into the bump to make it look like the cracks are going in. So I can click on this bump node here, and I'm going to bring it back so there's a bit more space, and I can press Shift D to duplicate it, and we can drop it here after the first bump. So the normal can go through the normal, but we now have another height value that we can add data into and mix multiple bumps together. So let's take the mix here, let's take the color, and I'm going to put that into the height of the bump. And then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Now the cracks aren't very strong right now, so to see them better, I'm going to turn the strength all the way up to 1 so that it is much more strong. And also if you wanted to, you could rename the bumps. So with the bump selected, you could press F2 to add a label, and then I could just call this like cracks bump. Like that. I could also click on this bump node here and then press F2 to give it a label, and I could just call this like noise bump, just to organize the nodes better. Now I want to have some areas where the bricks kind of have a dented area or kind of chunks taken out of them. So what I'm going to do is click on one of these bumps, and I can press Shift D to duplicate. I can drop it down here, and the normal can go into the normal. And then if I click on this bump node here, I can press F2 to change the label, and I'm just going to rename this to damage bump because I want to make the bricks look like they're a little bit damaged and maybe there's some chunks out of them. So I can now take the factor, and I want to put that into the height value of the damage bump. Now this is the same noise texture which is going into the noise bump, and so I want to make this damage bump a little bit more contrasty so it's a bit stronger and just in some areas. So I can click on any of these color ramps, and I can press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to drop it here before the damage bump, so just drop it down there. And then with the color ramp selected, I can hit the backspace to reset it. So I now want to click on the white tab, and I want to drag it over, and that's going to make it more contrasty. And if I Control Shift and select the damage bump, you can see what it's doing. So now there's just a few areas here and there where there's some little damage. And I want to make it a bit stronger, so I want to take the strength and I'm going to turn that up to like a 0.5 so it's a bit stronger. But then I'm also going to want to put this texture into the displacement later. So if I click on this black tab here, I want to turn this up and make it kind of like a light color so that it is more subtle. And this will be better for when we're putting this in the displacement. And the light gray color that I'm going to be using is a hex value of DA, DA, DA. So now you can see that there's some little damage here and there. So I'll just Control Shift and select the principled shader. But you can see that the damage isn't actually going in that much. So I want to take this color ramp and I want to put that into the displacement to actually make it pushing in. So I'm going to take the color here and I'm going to put that into the displacement of the material output. But when I do that, you can see that the material is having some weird issues. It's kind of jetting off to the side, and that is because I need to actually convert the color data into displacement data that the material output can use. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the displacement, and let's stick the displacement node here in the wire between the color ramp and the material output here. So just stick it right there, and then just so that it's not overlapping, I'm going to drag it right down here. Now we actually want the color ramp to be going into the height value of the displacement, and that way it's going to convert it to proper displacement data. Now you can see that it's way too strong, so let's turn the scale way down here on the displacement, and if we turn the scale down, it's going to be much more subtle. And I want to turn the displacement down to like a 0.01, so just a 0.01, so it's much more subtle. But now if I zoom in there, you can see that it is popping in a little bit. Now I also want to make the edges be a bit more bumpy, because if you look here on the edges, you can see it is pretty smooth. The displacement is working a little little bit to kind of make those little parts kind of go in a bit, but I want everything to be a little bit more bumpy so it just looks a bit more natural. So what I want to do is add another noise texture, and then we're going to mix it into the displacement. So I can actually just click on this noise texture right down here, and I'm going to press Control-Shift-D, and Control-Shift-D will duplicate the node, but it'll keep the wire plugged up. And I'm just going to drop it down here. And then I just want to Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. Now I want to turn the scale up a bit, so let's turn the scale to like a 15. And then I'll leave the detail at 15 and the roughness to 0.5. So I now want to mix this noise texture into the displacement. And so to do that, we can use a Mix RGB. So I can click on any of these Mix RGB nodes, and I can press Shift D to duplicate it. And we're going to stick it right down here before the displacement. So now what I can do is I can take this noise texture and I can take the factor, and I'm going to put that into the factor of this Mix RGB. And then I want this color ramp right here to be going into color 1 of the mix. And then I just want to add the dark values. So let's click on the mix here, and I can change this to darken. So I'm now going to take color 2 and I'm going to make it fully dark. So because this noise texture right over here is going into the factor is telling it where it's going to be color 1 and where it's going to be color 2. So we can make color 2 fully black, and now on the edges there, it is kind of bumpy and lumpy. But I still want the strength to be turned down. I don't want the strength to be turned up too high or it just won't look like brick. So I'm going to leave the scale at 0.01 so it is pretty subtle. So I can now Control Shift and select the principled shader. Now there is one more thing I want to show you. I want to show you how you can scale the entire texture. So this mapping node is plugged into all of the textures. And so we can use this scale value and we can scale it bigger or smaller, and we can adjust it depending on how big or small the object is. Now to change all these values at once, what I can actually do is press Shift A, go to the search, and I can just search for a value node. Let's put the value node here, and then the value can go into the scale. And then I want the default scale to be set to 1. So I can now just drag the scale, and that's going to change the size of the textures. So if I have a bigger object or a smaller object, I can just drag the value, and I can turn this up, and now it's much more detailed, but I'm going to leave this at the default of 1 because that is good for the size of these bricks. So there we go, there's the procedural brick material. So I'll just give this a final render. So thank you so much for watching this tutorial, and I hope you found it helpful. And if you'd like to help support me and my YouTube channel and purchase the project files, you can get that over on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. And I do appreciate your support. And you can also check out my Blender procedural material packs if you'd like to purchase more of my materials. And if you'd like to learn how to create any of my materials, then you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. And speaking of YouTube, if you'd like to help support this channel here on YouTube, then you can check out the YouTube memberships by clicking right down there on the join button next to the subscribe button. And you can also use the super thanks feature here on YouTube if you'd like to send me a little tip. But I hope you found this tutorial helpful, and thank you for watching.